The certified letter from the Sunset Meadows HOA arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, and I knew before opening it that Patricia Hendris was behind whatever complaint waited inside. My name is David Sullivan. I'm 58 years old, and after 33 years working as a civil engineer for the Colorado Department of Transportation, I'd finally retired to a quiet neighborhood in Littleton, Colorado, with my wife Angela and our two rescue dogs, Max and Bella. We'd bought our corner lot property specifically because it had a large backyard, where Angela could pursue her passion for gardening. She'd spent 2 years cultivating raised vegetable beds, a small greenhouse and flower gardens that were the envy of the neighborhood. 6 months after moving in, I'd installed a beautiful 6-foot cedar privacy fence along our property's south and west boundaries, partly to give Angela's gardens some protection from the wind, and partly to keep the dogs safely contained. I'd pulled permits, hired a licensed contractor, and even had the fence set back 3 inches from what I believed were the property lines, just to be absolutely certain we weren't encroaching on anyone's space. The fence cost $8,400, and I'd considered it money well spent for the privacy and security it provided. That fence had been standing for 14 months without a single complaint from anyone, until Patricia decided it was somehow her business. Patricia Hendris was the kind of person who made HOA horror stories seem understated. She'd been on the Sunset Meadows HOA board for 9 years, serving as president for the last 5, and she ran the neighborhood like a fiefdom. I'd met her during our second week in the house, when she appeared at our door with her signature clipboard, wearing a sun visor despite it being 7 p.m., and proceeded to lecture Angela and me about the community standards for exactly 45 minutes. She covered everything from the acceptable shade range for house trim paint to the precise height requirements for lawn grass to the pre-approved list of mailbox designs that we were required to choose from. My engineering background meant I appreciated rules and specifications when they served a purpose, but Patricia's obsession with control went far beyond reasonable community governance. She talked about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, with an intensity that suggested she believed our subdivision was some kind of historic landmark, rather than a standard suburban development built in 2008. Still, Angela and I figured if we followed the rules and kept to ourselves, we'd avoid any conflict. We were wrong. The letter I held in my hands was typed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Patricia in her capacity as board president. "Dear Mr. Sullivan," it began, "it has come to the attention of the Architectural Review Committee that the fence structure erected on your property at 4782 Meadowbrook Lane is in violation of Section 12.4 of the Sunset Meadows Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, as well as Section 6.2 regarding property line encroachments. Specifically, our measurements indicate that your fence extends approximately 18 to 24 inches beyond your property line onto the common area green space along Meadowbrook Lane and onto the adjoining property at 4786 Meadowbrook Lane. This constitutes an unauthorized encroachment and must be remedied immediately. You are hereby required to remove the encroaching portions of the fence within 30 days of this notice, or, alternatively, relocate the entire fence structure to conform with your actual property boundaries. Failure to comply will result in fines of $200 per day beginning on day 31, and the HOA reserves the right to remove the encroachment at your expense. Please contact the HOA office to schedule a compliance verification inspection once corrections have been made." I read the letter 3 times, my confusion growing with each pass. 18 to 24 inches onto common area and my neighbor's property. That was impossible. I'd hired a professional contractor who had specifically used the property pins marked during our home purchase survey to place the fence. My neighbor at 4786 Meadowbrook was Tom Erickson, a retired high school teacher who had actually complimented the fence when it was installed and had never mentioned any issue with its placement. That evening, I walked over to Tom's house with the letter in hand. Tom answered the door looking puzzled when I asked if he'd had any concerns about our shared property line or the fence. "Concerns? No, why would I?" he said, genuinely confused. "That fence is perfect. It's right where it should be, and honestly, it's improved both our properties. Why do you ask?" I showed him Patricia's letter, and his expression shifted from confusion to disgust. "Oh, for crying out loud," he muttered. "This is Patricia creating problems where none exist. She's been on a rampage lately. Did you hear what she did to the Johnsons?" I hadn't heard, so Tom filled me in. Apparently, the Johnsons, who lived 3 houses down, had painted their front door a color Patricia deemed non-compliant. It was a shade called Heritage Red that was literally on the HOA's approved color list, but Patricia insisted it was too bright and fined them $150. When they appealed with proof of the approval, she claimed the approved list was outdated, and they should have checked with her personally. The Johnsons eventually repainted their door a boring beige just to end the harassment. "She's done this to at least 6 families since I've lived here," Tom continued. "She finds something to complain about, usually something technical that most people can't easily disprove, and then she either forces them to comply with her demands or fines them into submission. It's a power trip, pure and simple." He looked at the letter again and shook his head. "But this is bold even for her, claiming your fence encroaches on my property when it absolutely doesn't. If she'd bothered to ask me, I'd have told her there's no issue. What are you going to do?" I told Tom I'd start by getting documentation that the fence was properly placed, and he offered to provide a written statement confirming he had no objection to the fence's location and had never claimed it encroached on his land. The next morning, I called the surveying company that had conducted our property survey when we purchased the house. They were able to pull up their records and confirmed they still had the exact GPS coordinates for all our property corners. For $600, they could send a licensed surveyor out within the week to verify the fence placement against the original survey markers. I authorized the work immediately, and I also sent a formal written response to the HOA stating that I disputed their claim entirely, that my fence had been installed based on a professional survey, that my adjoining neighbor had no complaint, and that I would be obtaining an updated survey to document the fence's proper placement. I cited Colorado Revised Statutes, paragraph 38, 33.32, 209.5, which requires HOAs to provide homeowners with an opportunity to contest alleged violations before imposing fines. And I formally requested a hearing before the board to present my evidence once the survey was complete. I kept my tone professional and factual. 33 years in civil engineering had taught me that documentation and proper procedure trump emotion every time. Patricia's response came back within 2 days, and it was breathtaking in its arrogance. "Mr. Sullivan, your request for a hearing is noted. However, the HOA's determination regarding the encroachment is based on measurements conducted by the Architectural Review Committee and is considered final unless you can provide definitive proof otherwise. The 30-day compliance deadline remains in effect. As a courtesy, I personally remeasured your fence placement last weekend and can confirm with certainty that it extends beyond your property boundaries. I have been managing this community for 9 years and am quite familiar with all property lines in our neighborhood. I suggest you accept the finding and begin making arrangements to relocate your fence to avoid accumulating fines." The letter wasn't even on official letterhead this time. It was printed on Patricia's personal stationery with her home address, which struck me as odd for what was supposed to be official HOA business. but it was her claim about personally measuring my fence that caught my attention. How exactly had she measured? Against what reference points? Property boundaries aren't just arbitrary lines you can eyeball. They're based on surveyed markers and legal descriptions recorded with the county. The fact that she claimed to be quite familiar with all property lines, without any apparent surveying credentials or equipment, was either remarkably presumptuous or incredibly suspicious. The surveyor, a woman named Jennifer Martinez from Front Range Survey Solutions, arrived the following Tuesday morning with a total station theodolite and GPS equipment. She was thorough and professional, explaining that she'd be locating the original survey monuments, the iron pins driven at each property corner, and then using precise measurements to verify the fence location against the legal property description filed with Arapahoe County. Angela and I watched as Jennifer worked methodically around our property, using a metal detector to locate pins that had been buried under 14 months of grass growth and soil accumulation. The process took about 3 hours, and when Jennifer finally packed up her equipment and asked us to come inside to review her findings, I could tell from her expression that something interesting had emerged. She spread out a detailed plot drawing on our dining room table, showing our lot boundaries, the fence location, and the property corners marked with GPS coordinates accurate to within centimeters. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, "your fence is located entirely within your property boundaries. In fact, it's set back between 2 and 4 inches from your actual property line along both the south and west sides, exactly as it should be for a fence this size to account for any minor settling or movement over time. There is absolutely no encroachment onto any adjacent property or common area. Whoever told you otherwise was either measuring from incorrect reference points or was mistaken about where your property lines are actually located." San Antoine Tilton. I felt a wave of relief mixed with anger. Relief that my fence was properly placed, and anger that Patricia had apparently fabricated or incompetently measured an encroachment that didn't exist. But then Jennifer said something that made the situation far more interesting. "However, while I was locating your property corners, I noticed something unusual about the property immediately to your south, the common area green space strip along Meadowbrook Lane." She pointed to her survey drawing, which showed not just my property, but also the surrounding lots and common areas. The common area along this section of Meadowbrook is supposed to be approximately 12 feet wide, according to the recorded plat for your subdivision. But the actual vegetation line, where the maintained grass ends and the properties begin, is only about 6 to 8 feet from the street curb. I checked the property markers for the lots across the street, and it appears that several homeowners on the south side of Meadowbrook, including the property at 4786, may have been maintaining and effectively using portions of the HOA common area as part of their yards for years, possibly without realizing it. She paused and pulled out another document, a copy of the recorded subdivision plat from the county assessor's office. And here's where it gets particularly interesting. The property at 4790 Meadowbrook Lane, I believe that's owned by Patricia Hendris based on the county records, shows the same pattern, but more extensively. Based on the survey monuments I could observe from your property, it appears that Mrs. Hendrix's landscaping, including a substantial portion of her garden beds, and hardscaping extends approximately 4 to 5 feet beyond her legal property line into what should be HOA common area. I stared at the documents, my engineering brain immediately grasping the implications. Patricia Hendris, the woman who'd accused my properly placed fence of encroaching on common area, had apparently been encroaching on that same common area herself, and far more significantly, for years. The irony was stunning, but more than that, if what Jennifer was suggesting was accurate, Patricia had potentially violated the exact same CC&R sections she'd accused me of violating, plus she'd been using common area property that legally belonged to the HOA and, by extension, to all the homeowners collectively. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "would you be able to conduct a full survey of Patricia's property to document exactly where her improvements are located relative to her legal boundaries?" Jennifer nodded. "I could, but I'd need authorization from either Mrs. Hendris or the HOA, since I'd need access to her property to locate the survey monuments. However, I can provide you with a preliminary analysis based on what I observed from the public right-of-way and your property, combined with the recorded plat and county GIS data. That wouldn't be suitable for legal action, but it would give you a pretty clear picture of the situation." I authorized Jennifer to prepare the preliminary analysis as an addendum to my survey report, which would add another $400 to the bill, but I considered it money well spent. If Patricia wanted to play games about property encroachments, she was about to discover that I'd spent 3 decades working with surveys, legal descriptions, right-of-way documents, and property boundaries. This was literally what I'd done for a living. Jennifer's complete report, including the preliminary analysis of surrounding properties, arrived via email 3 days later as a professionally bound PDF with detailed exhibits, photos, and technical specifications. The findings regarding my fence were definitive: 0 encroachment, proper setback, full compliance with all applicable codes and CC&Rs. But the addendum regarding Patricia's property was illuminating in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. According to Jennifer's analysis based on the recorded plat, county GIS property lines, and observable monuments, Patricia Hendris's property had encroachments that included approximately 180 square feet of landscaped garden beds extending between 4 and 5 feet beyond her property line into HOA common area, a decorative stone border and pathway that crossed her property line, a portion of her irrigation system that served the encroaching landscape areas, and most significantly, a custom-built storage shed, visible from the street, that appeared to be situated at least partially on common area property. Jennifer's report included survey-grade photos with overlay graphics showing the recorded property lines versus the actual improvements, and the evidence was visually compelling even to a layperson. Jennifer noted in her analysis that these encroachments had likely existed for many years based on the mature plantings and weathering of the hardscape, which suggested they'd either been installed without proper survey verification or had been knowingly placed with disregard for property boundaries. I spent that evening carefully reviewing Colorado HOA law, particularly the sections dealing with architectural review, common area management, and board member fiduciary duties. Colorado Revised Statutes, paragraph 38, 33.3, 302, specifies that HOA boards have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of all homeowners and to manage common areas responsibly. Section paragraph 38, 33.3, 209.5 establishes that HOAs must follow specific procedures before imposing fines, including providing notice and an opportunity to be heard. And here's where Patricia's behavior became legally problematic. By selectively enforcing alleged encroachments against me while ignoring, or more likely, being willfully blind to, her own far more substantial encroachments, she was violating her fiduciary duty and engaging in what Colorado courts have recognized as selective enforcement, which can invalidate HOA actions. I also researched adverse possession and prescriptive easement laws in Colorado, wondering if Patricia might try to claim she'd gained legal rights to the common area through long-term use. However, Colorado law is clear that adverse possession claims don't work against property held by HOAs on behalf of homeowners unless the statutory requirements are met, including open notorious hostile use for at least 18 years under certain conditions. And even then, HOA common area has special protections. Patricia's encroachments appeared to be maybe 8 to 10 years old at most, based on the property records and aerial photography I pulled from county records, which meant she had no legitimate adverse possession claim. Armed with Jennifer's report and my legal research, I prepared a comprehensive response package for the HOA board. I included Jennifer's complete survey report proving my fence was properly located with zero encroachment, Tom Erickson's notarized statement confirming he had no objection to the fence and had never claimed any encroachment on his property, copies of the original building permit and contractor documentation showing the fence had been professionally installed, citations to the relevant Colorado statutes regarding HOA enforcement procedures and fiduciary duties, and most importantly, Jennifer's preliminary analysis showing Patricia's own encroachments onto HOA common area, with a formal request that the board investigate this matter and take appropriate enforcement action consistent with their obligations under the CC&Rs. I also demanded that the violation notice against me be immediately rescinded, that the HOA provide a written apology acknowledging the false accusation, and that the board schedule a hearing within 30 days, as required by Colorado law, to address both my situation and Patricia's encroachments. I sent the package via certified mail to all 5 board members individually, Patricia plus 4 others, whose names I'd found in the HOA's annual meeting minutes posted on the community website, and I copied the HOA's management company, which handled the administrative functions for our neighborhood. The response was faster and more defensive than I'd expected. 2 days after my certified letters were delivered, I received a phone call from Patricia herself. Not a letter, not an email, but an actual phone call to my cell phone, which I found presumptuous given that this was supposed to be official HOA business. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Patricia Hendris," she began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I've received your rather accusatory package, and I have to say I'm extremely disappointed in your approach to this matter. Rather than working cooperatively with the HOA to resolve a simple property line issue, you've chosen to launch what amounts to a personal attack on me with unfounded allegations." I let her finish, then responded calmly. "Mrs. Hendris, I sent documentation to the board proving that your violation notice was factually incorrect. My fence doesn't encroach on anything, and I have a professional survey to prove it. As for the information regarding your property, that's not an attack. It's a legitimate concern about consistent enforcement of the CC&Rs. If the HOA is going to claim encroachments are violations, then all encroachments need to be addressed, including yours." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her recalculating her approach. "The survey you provided is based on old markers that may have shifted," she said, her voice taking on a condescending tone. "And as for my property, I've been living here for 12 years, and my landscaping was installed by professionals who certainly would have known where the property lines were. You're new to this neighborhood, Mr. Sullivan, and perhaps you don't understand how things work here yet. I'm willing to overlook your accusatory tone if you'll simply agree to adjust your fence as requested, and we can all move forward." I felt my jaw clench, not from anger, but from the sheer audacity of her position. "Mrs. Hendris, survey monuments don't shift in ways that would affect measurements by more than millimeters, and Jennifer Martinez is a licensed professional land surveyor whose work is legally defensible in court. My fence is staying exactly where it is because it's properly located. And I'm not new to understanding property boundaries. I spent 33 years as a civil engineer working with surveys, right-of-way documents, and legal descriptions for the Colorado Department of Transportation. I probably have more experience interpreting property documents than anyone else in this neighborhood. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to rescind the violation notice against me? The board is going to schedule a hearing as I've requested, and we're going to address the actual encroachment issue in this neighborhood, which appears to be on your property, not mine." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Finally, Patricia said coldly, "You're making a very serious mistake, Mr. Sullivan. I've been managing this community for 9 years, and I don't appreciate homeowners who think they can bully their way out of legitimate violations. Consider this your final warning. Comply with the HOA's directive or face the consequences." She hung up before I could respond. Angela, who'd been listening from across the room, looked at me with concern. "That sounded threatening," she said. "What do you think she'll do?" I honestly didn't know, but my gut told me Patricia wasn't going to back down gracefully. She'd been used to getting her way for too long and having a homeowner challenge her with actual documentation, and legal knowledge was probably a first for her. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated in ways that confirmed Patricia's character. First, I received a second violation notice, this time claiming that my fence color was non-compliant with the architectural standards, despite the fact that natural cedar was explicitly listed as an approved material in the CCNRs and had been approved on my original architectural review application. Then I received a third notice claiming that our garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, which was technically accurate. I'd left them by the side gate on a Wednesday, when trash pickup wasn't until Thursday. But this was a violation that literally dozens of homeowners committed every single week without any enforcement. It was obvious Patricia was retaliating by finding any excuse to issue violations. But she made a critical mistake. She continued issuing these notices on her personal letterhead, signing them as HOA president, but not following the formal notice procedures required by Colorado law or the HOA's own bylaws. She never sent copies to the other board members, never documented the violations in official board meeting minutes, and never provided the formal hearing opportunity required by statute. She was essentially acting as a one-person enforcement army, which was both a violation of her fiduciary duty and a violation of the HOA's governing documents that required board votes for enforcement actions. I documented everything meticulously, every letter, every date received, every alleged violation, and I started reaching out to other homeowners in the neighborhood to learn about their experiences with Patricia and the HOA board. What I discovered was disturbing, but not surprising. Tom connected me with the Johnsons, who told me about the door paint debacle, and they introduced me to the Patels, who'd been fined $800 for installing solar panels that were actually pre-approved by the architectural committee before Patricia unilaterally decided they were aesthetically incompatible with the neighborhood. The Patels had paid the fine just to avoid further conflict because Mrs. Patel was recovering from cancer treatment, and they didn't have the energy to fight. I met the Kramers, who'd been threatened with a lien for letting their grass grow to 3 inches instead of the mandated 2.5 inches during a drought when the county was asking residents to conserve water. And I met Susan Chen, a single mother who'd been fined $600 for hanging a small decorative flag from her porch, an American flag supporting her brother who was serving in the Navy, which Patricia claimed violated the no signs or banners rules, despite Colorado having specific statutory protections for flag displays. Every story followed the same pattern. Patricia would find some technical violation, issue threats and fines, and most people would either comply or pay rather than fight because they didn't know their rights or couldn't afford the time and expense of challenging her. Those who did push back found themselves subjected to escalating harassment through additional violation notices until they either moved away or gave up. By the end of those 2 weeks, I'd collected written statements from 11 different homeowners documenting Patricia's pattern of selective enforcement, retaliation, and what increasingly appeared to be a systematic abuse of her position. I also discovered something interesting while reviewing the HOA's financial records, which Colorado law requires to be made available to homeowners upon request. I submitted a formal records request to the management company, and after some initial resistance, which I overcame by citing CRS 38 to 33.3, 317, requiring HOAs to provide records within 30 days, I received copies of the HOA's financial statements, bank records, and expenditure reports for the past 3 years. What I found was enlightening. Patricia had authorized payments totaling $28,000 over 3 years to Hendris Landscape Design for community beautification services and common area maintenance. A quick business registry search revealed that Hendris Landscape Design was owned by Patricia's daughter, Melissa Hendris, and was registered at Patricia's home address. The payments weren't necessarily illegal if they were for legitimate services at fair market rates, but the fact that Patricia had never disclosed this conflict of interest, never recused herself from votes authorizing these expenditures, and never solicited competitive bids raised serious questions about whether she was violating her fiduciary duty to the homeowners. Armed with this growing pile of evidence, the survey proving my fence was proper, the pattern of selective enforcement affecting multiple homeowners, the undisclosed financial conflicts and Patricia's own encroachments onto common area, I consulted with an attorney who specialized in HOA law. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he'd been practicing Colorado HOA and real estate law for 23 years. I brought him everything I'd collected, and he spent an hour reviewing the documents while I explained the situation. When he finally looked up, he was smiling. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "you've built a better case file than some of my paralegals do. This is extremely well documented, and you've identified multiple serious violations of Colorado HOA law and Mrs. Hendrix's fiduciary duties as a board member." He explained that I had several options. I could file a formal complaint with the HOA board demanding Patricia's removal. I could file a lawsuit against the HOA and Patricia personally for selective enforcement, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty. Or I could file complaints with the Colorado Attorney General's office and the local district attorney regarding the potential financial improprieties. Robert recommended starting with a comprehensive demand letter to the full HOA board, copied to the management company and the HOA's insurance carrier, laying out all the violations and demanding specific corrective actions, including rescinding all violations against me, conducting a full survey of common area encroachments throughout the neighborhood, investigating the financial conflicts, and removing Patricia from the board. This kind of letter often motivates boards to take action, Robert explained, because once the insurance carrier is aware of potential liability, they typically require the HOA to address the issues to avoid losing coverage. Robert drafted the demand letter, and it was a masterpiece of legal precision. 8 pages long, it detailed every violation of Colorado law, every breach of fiduciary duty, every instance of selective enforcement, and every financial irregularity, all supported by exhibits including the survey reports, homeowner statements, financial records, and photographs. The letter demanded that within 14 days, the HOA must formally rescind all violation notices issued to me, provide a written apology acknowledging the false accusations, conduct a comprehensive survey of all properties adjacent to common areas to identify any and all encroachments, take appropriate enforcement action against any encroachments identified, including those on Patricia's property, investigate the payments to Hendris Landscape Design, and recover any amounts that were improperly authorized, remove Patricia from the board for violations of her fiduciary duty, and implement new policies to prevent future selective enforcement and conflicts of interest. The letter concluded by stating that if these demands were not met, I would pursue all available legal remedies, including filing a lawsuit for damages, requesting injunctive relief, and filing complaints with state authorities. Robert sent the letter via certified mail and email to all 5 board members, the management company, and the HOA's insurance carrier, and we waited to see what would happen. The response came within a week, but not from Patricia, from the HOA's insurance carrier. Their risk management attorney contacted Robert directly to schedule a meeting with the full HOA board to discuss the concerns raised in Mr. Sullivan's correspondence. Apparently, the insurance company had reviewed the demand letter and determined that the HOA faced significant liability exposure if the allegations were accurate, and they'd instructed the board to address the situation immediately or risk losing coverage. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse, and all homeowners were notified that it would be an open meeting under Colorado's HOA open meeting requirements. Angela and I arrived to find the parking lot packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the meeting's purpose, and at least 60 homeowners showed up, filling every seat and lining the walls. The 4 board members, other than Patricia, sat at a table in front, along with a representative from the management company and the insurance company's attorney. Patricia sat off to the side, her expression tight and controlled, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. The board's vice president, a man named Richard Flores, who I'd learned was a retired accountant, opened the meeting by acknowledging that the board had received my demand letter and supporting documentation, and that they'd spent the past week reviewing the materials and consulting with their legal and insurance advisors. After careful consideration, Richard said, his voice formal and uncomfortable, the board has determined that immediate action is necessary to address the concerns raised and to fulfill our fiduciary obligations to the homeowners of Sunset Meadows. First, all violation notices issued to David and Angela Sullivan are hereby rescinded, and we apologize for any inconvenience or distress caused by the erroneous allegations regarding their fence placement. The survey provided by Mr. Sullivan clearly demonstrates that no encroachment exists. There was a murmur through the crowd. This was the first public acknowledgement that Patricia had been wrong. Richard continued, Second, the board has authorized the engagement of Front Range Survey Solutions to conduct a comprehensive survey of all properties adjacent to HOA common areas to identify any encroachments that may exist. Any encroachments identified will be addressed in accordance with the CC&Rs and Colorado law without exception. Patricia's face had gone from tight to pale, and I saw her hand grip the edge of her chair. Third, Richard said, his voice becoming even more uncomfortable, the board has reviewed the financial records regarding payments to Hendris Landscape Design. While we have not completed a full investigation, the preliminary review raises questions about proper authorization, disclosure of conflicts of interest, and competitive bidding. The board is engaging an independent auditor to review all expenditures over the past 5 years, and we will take appropriate action based on their findings. Then Richard paused, glanced at the other board members, and took a deep breath. Finally, the board has accepted the resignation of Patricia Hendris as board president, effective immediately. The room erupted in whispers and a few outright gasps. Patricia stood up, her face now flushed with anger and humiliation. "I did not resign," she said loudly. "This is a coup orchestrated by a newcomer who doesn't respect this community's standards, and I will not stand by while—" Richard cut her off, his voice firm. "Patricia, you submitted your resignation in writing this afternoon after we informed you that if you did not resign voluntarily, we would vote to remove you for cause based on violations of your fiduciary duties, conflicts of interest, and selective enforcement. You chose to resign. This meeting is to inform the homeowners of the actions the board is taking to correct the situation." Patricia looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support, but the homeowners stared back at her with expressions ranging from satisfaction to outright hostility. These were people she'd bullied and harassed for years, and they weren't about to defend her now. She grabbed her purse, shot me a look of pure venom, and stormed out of the clubhouse, the door slamming behind her. The meeting continued for another hour, as homeowners asked questions, shared their own stories of Patricia's enforcement actions, and discussed what reforms needed to be implemented to prevent future abuse. Susan Chen stood up and talked about her flag violation, her voice shaking with emotion as she described how humiliated she had felt, being told she couldn't honor her brother's military service. The Patels described their solar panel ordeal, and Mr. Patel noted that they'd lost thousands of dollars in energy savings during the months they'd been forced to disconnect the system during Patricia's review. Multiple homeowners suggested that the CCNRs needed to be revised to include clearer definitions of violations, a formal appeals process, requirements for competitive bidding on contracts, and mandatory disclosure of conflicts of interest for board members. Richard Flores, who was now acting as interim board president, took notes and committed to forming a committee of homeowners to review and propose amendments to the governing documents. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense of relief and hope in the community. The tyrant had been deposed, and people felt like they could finally live in their homes without fear of arbitrary harassment. But Patricia wasn't done yet. 3 days after the meeting, I received a letter from an attorney named Philip Hartman, who identified himself as representing Patricia Hendris in a personal capacity. The letter was a bizarre mix of legal threats and emotional grievances, claiming that I had defamed Patricia by making false and malicious statements about her conduct, that I had conspired to damage her reputation and force her removal from the board, and that I had caused her severe emotional distress through my harassment and intimidation. The letter demanded that I issue a public apology, pay Patricia $50,000 in damages, and sign a statement agreeing never to discuss her or her tenure on the board again. If I didn't comply within 10 days, the letter threatened, Patricia would file a lawsuit for defamation, civil conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I forwarded the letter to Robert Caldwell, who actually laughed when he read it. "This is a frivolous intimidation tactic," he said. "Everything you presented to the board was documented fact, and truth is an absolute defense to defamation. You didn't defame her. You exposed her misconduct with evidence. As for civil conspiracy and emotional distress, those claims are nonsense. She's just angry and lashing out." Robert drafted a response letter that was professionally polite, but essentially told Philip Hartman that his client had no case that I would not be intimidated into silence, and that if Patricia filed a frivolous lawsuit, we would seek sanctions and attorney's fees under Colorado's rules regarding groundless litigation. We never heard back from Hartman, and no lawsuit was ever filed. Meanwhile, the comprehensive survey that the board had authorized was completed over the next 6 weeks, and the results were even more revealing than Jennifer Martinez's preliminary analysis had suggested. The survey identified encroachments on 8 different properties throughout Sunset Meadows, totaling approximately 2,400 square feet of common area that had been absorbed into private yards through landscaping, fences, sheds, and other improvements. By far the largest single encroachment, accounting for nearly 180 square feet, was on Patricia Hendris's property, exactly as Jennifer had predicted. Her garden beds, stone borders, irrigation system, and storage shed all extended beyond her legal property line onto what was supposed to be HOA common area maintained for the benefit of all homeowners. The survey report included detailed exhibits and recommendations for remediation, noting that under Colorado law and the CCNRs, the HOA was required to either require removal of the encroachments or negotiate easement agreements whereby the encroaching homeowners would pay fair market value for the permanent use of the common area. The board sent formal notices to all 8 affected homeowners, including Patricia requiring them to either remove the encroachments within 90 days or negotiate an easement purchase at a rate of 45 feet per square foot based on recent appraisals, which worked out to $8,100 for Patricia's encroachment. Patricia's response was to hire a different attorney, a more competent one this time, who sent the HOA a letter claiming that Patricia had acquired rights to the common area through adverse possession because her landscaping had been in place for 12 years. The letter cited Colorado's adverse possession statutes and demanded that the HOA acknowledge her ownership of the disputed area. Robert Caldwell, who was now representing the HOA at the board's request to handle the encroachment issues, responded with a detailed legal memorandum explaining why Patricia's adverse possession claim failed under Colorado law. Specifically, Colorado requires adverse possession claimants to prove 18 years of continuous, open, notorious, hostile, and exclusive use under a claim of right, along with payment of property taxes on the disputed area. Patricia's landscaping had only been in place for 12 years, not long enough, and she'd never paid property taxes on the common area because it was assessed and taxed as HOA property. Furthermore, Colorado courts have held that use of HOA common area, even if long-term generally doesn't constitute hostile, use sufficient for adverse possession because homeowners have a right to use common areas as members of the HOA, which negates the hostility requirement. Patricia's claim was legally dead on arrival, and her attorney eventually acknowledged as much. She was given the same choice as the other 7 homeowners: remove the encroachments or pay for an easement. In the end, 6 of the 8 homeowners chose to negotiate easement agreements and pay for the permanent use of the common area they'd been occupying. Most of them legitimately hadn't realized their improvements crossed the property line, and they were willing to make things right once it was clearly documented. One homeowner chose to relocate a fence that had been slightly encroaching, and the work was completed amicably. Patricia, however, refused to do either. She ignored the 90-day deadline, refused to respond to the board's follow-up letters, and apparently hoped that if she just dug in her heels, the board would give up and leave her alone. The same strategy she'd used when she was in power. She badly miscalculated. When the deadline passed without compliance, the board filed a lawsuit in Arapahoe County District Court, seeking an injunction requiring Patricia to remove the encroachments and pay for the HOA's legal costs and surveying expenses. The lawsuit was straightforward because the survey evidence was indisputable. Patricia's improvements were clearly on HOA property. She had no legal right to be there, and she'd refused to remedy the violation despite multiple opportunities. The judge granted the injunction within 3 months, ordering Patricia to remove all encroaching improvements within 30 days, or the HOA could hire contractors to do the removal at her expense with costs added to her property as a lien. The judge also awarded the HOA $18,400 in legal fees and costs, which were assessed against Patricia personally. Patricia finally hired a landscaping company, not her daughters, interestingly, to remove the encroaching portions of her garden beds, relocate her stone borders to within her property line, and move her storage shed 4 feet north onto her actual property. The work took a week and cost her over $6,000, according to neighborhood gossip. Plus, she had to pay the $18,400 judgment to the HOA. The financial audit that the board had commissioned came back with findings that $22,500 in payments to Hendris Landscape Design had been improperly authorized. The work had either been duplicative of services already provided by the HOA's contracted landscape company, billed at rates significantly above market value, or in some cases, never actually performed. Patricia's daughter Melissa was required to return the $22,500, and when she initially refused, the HOA filed a civil claim in small claims court and won a judgment. Melissa eventually paid under threat of wage garnishment. Patricia and her husband quietly listed their house for sale 6 months after the board meeting, and they moved to a different subdivision in Aurora, one without an HOA, I later heard. The house sold quickly despite the controversy, and a lovely young couple with 2 small children moved in, immediately becoming positive contributors to the neighborhood. As for Sunset Meadows, the community underwent a genuine transformation over the following year. The committee formed to review the governing documents proposed comprehensive amendments that were approved by 78% of homeowners in a special vote. The new CCNRs included clearer violation definitions with photographic examples, a formal 3-tier appeals process with written decisions required at each level, mandatory competitive bidding for any contract over $5,000, required disclosure and recusal procedures for conflicts of interest, and a provision that all enforcement actions required a vote of at least 3 board members rather than unilateral decisions by the president. The board also implemented quarterly financial transparency reports posted on the HOA website, annual town hall meetings where homeowners could raise concerns directly, and an anonymous reporting system for potential violations so that neighbors wouldn't be pressured to report each other. Richard Flores was elected president in the next regular election, and he recruited a diverse board, including Tom Erickson, Susan Chen, and 2 other homeowners committed to fair and transparent governance. Violation notices dropped by 85% in the first year after Patricia's removal, not because people were suddenly breaking rules more often, but because the enforcement had been so arbitrary and excessive under her regime that returning to reasonable standards felt like a dramatic change. For Angela and me, life returned to peaceful normalcy. Our fence still stands exactly where it was built, properly placed, legally compliant, and now documented by multiple surveys to be completely within our property boundaries. Angela's gardens have flourished, and she actually won 2nd place in the neighborhood garden competition the following summer. A competition that Patricia had ironically started years earlier but had never won herself. Our dogs Max and Bella continued to enjoy their securely fenced yard, completely oblivious to the drama their fence caused. I've been elected to the Architectural Review Committee, where I use my engineering background to help homeowners understand the technical requirements and ensure that reviews are conducted fairly and consistently. Tom and I have become close friends, and we often joke about the Great Fence War of 2019 over beers on his back patio. The 11 homeowners who provided statements about Patricia's harassment have all told me at various times that they're grateful someone finally stood up to her, and several mentioned they'd been thinking about moving before the situation was resolved because they couldn't stand living under her arbitrary rule anymore. Looking back on those 8 months from Patricia's first violation letter to her eventual departure from the neighborhood, I recognize it wasn't just about offense, it was about one person's abuse of power and a community's collective tolerance of that abuse, because challenging it seemed too difficult or risky. The costs were real. I spent over $7,000 on surveys, legal consultations, and related expenses, though the HOA eventually reimbursed me $3,500 of that as part of their acknowledgement that the enforcement action against me was improper. The emotional toll was significant. Angela lost sleep worrying about whether we'd lose our home over escalating fines, and I spent countless hours researching laws, gathering evidence, and preparing documents when I'd rather have been enjoying retirement. But the costs were worth it, not just for my family's peace of mind, but for the entire community that was liberated from a tyrant's control. The experience taught me that HOA boards wield enormous power over homeowners' daily lives and financial security, which makes accountability and transparency absolutely essential. It also reinforced something I'd learned in my engineering career. Documentation is everything. Emotions and accusations fade, but precise measurements, written records, and professional analyses stand up under scrutiny. If you're dealing with an overreaching HOA or a power-hungry board member, here's my advice based on what worked. First, know your rights under your state's HOA laws. Every state has statutes governing how HOAs must operate, what procedures they must follow, and what protections homeowners have. And those laws supersede CC&Rs when there's a conflict. Second, document everything obsessively. Every letter, every email, every conversation, every deadline, every alleged violation, because patterns of behavior and procedural failures become obvious when you have a comprehensive timeline. Third, get professional verification when you're accused of violations, whether that's a survey, an inspection report, a legal opinion, or expert testimony. Having credible third-party evidence is far more powerful than your word against the boards. Fourth, understand that selective enforcement is a valid legal defense in most states. If the HOA ignores the same violation when others commit it, but enforces it against you, that's actionable discrimination. Fifth, connect with other affected homeowners because strength in numbers matters. Boards are much less likely to persist in bad behavior when they realize the entire community is watching and documenting. Sixth, use the formal processes available under your state law and governing documents. Request hearings, submit written appeals, demand records, attend board meetings, because exhausting those processes strengthens your legal position if you eventually need to file a lawsuit. And finally, don't be afraid to consult an attorney early. Many HOA attorneys offer free or low-cost initial consultations, and knowing your legal options can help you make strategic decisions before small problems become expensive battles. So that's the story of how Patricia Hendris, the HOA Karen, who claimed my fence was encroaching on her property, ended up being proven to have been stealing common area land for years, lost her position on the board, was forced to remove her own encroachments, at significant expense had to return over $20,000 in improperly authorized payments, and eventually fled the neighborhood in embarrassment. The irony of someone who'd spent years harassing homeowners over trivial violations being caught in far more serious violations herself was not lost on anyone. And the karmic justice of a woman who'd claimed expertise about property lines despite having zero credentials being proven wrong by actual licensed surveyors using precision equipment was deeply satisfying. But beyond the personal vindication, the real victory was seeing an entire community transform from fearful and divided to engaged and empowered, watching neighbors who'd been too intimidated to speak up find their voices, and helping establish governance systems that prioritize fairness and transparency over arbitrary control. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you dealt with an HOA that overstepped its authority? Have you had a board member who seemed to make up rules as they went along or enforce them selectively based on personal vendettas? What was your craziest HOA violation story? Drop your experiences in the comments below because I read every single one, and your story might just end up featured in a future video. If watching Patricia's spectacular downfall from HOA tyrant to exposed hypocrite gave you that satisfying justice feeling, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more of these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, because trust me, what I have coming tomorrow is going to blow your mind even more than this one. Speaking of HOA boards learning painful lessons about targeting the wrong homeowner, tomorrow's story takes things to an entirely different level. Picture this: an HOA Karen, who's used to intimidating everyone in her rural subdivision, decides to sue a rancher for blocking her access across his private land. Land she'd been trespassing on for years because she thought the dirt road through his property was public. This woman was so arrogant, so convinced of her entitlement, that she actually filed a lawsuit demanding a permanent easement across his ranch, claiming she had prescriptive rights because she'd been using the road for a decade. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to research before filing her lawsuit, was that the rancher she was suing was a retired district court judge with 32 years on the bench, an encyclopedic knowledge of property law, and absolutely zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. This judge didn't just defend himself. He countersued for trespassing filed for sanctions under Rule 11, for filing a groundless lawsuit, brought in historical deed records proving the road had always been private, and then systematically dismantled her case so thoroughly that her own attorney withdrew from representation halfway through because he was afraid of being sanctioned himself. The courtroom beatdown was so comprehensive, so professionally devastating, that it became a cautionary tale in Colorado legal circles about the dangers of suing people without doing basic research about who they are. And the financial consequences for this HOA Karen were absolutely ruinous. We're talking 6 figures in judgments, legal fees, and court-ordered sanctions that forced her to sell her property and declare bankruptcy. I'm going to walk you through every strategic move this retired judge made, every legal principle he invoked, and exactly how he turned what she thought would be an easy intimidation lawsuit into a masterclass in property rights litigation that destroyed her financially and legally. This is hands down one of the most intellectually satisfying legal destructions I've ever covered, and you absolutely cannot miss it. Make sure you are back here tomorrow at the same time. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now, because this story is going to be absolutely epic. And watching a bully realize she's picked a fight with someone who wrote the literal textbook on property law is the kind of justice that will have you standing up and cheering. See you tomorrow.